Welcome to tonight's presentation of Language and Food. I'm Rebecca Roberts, the curator of programming here at Planet Word. Language and is a series that we are able to bring you thanks to the generosity of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Foundation. Every month we explore the intersection of language and something else. We started this in February. This is our third episode. Next month in May, we'll be exploring language and gender on May 26th with Amanda Montell. But look for those programs throughout the rest of the year on our website. And as always, if you found out about this program because you're a member and you're getting our newsletter and you're following us on social media, thank you so much for that support. It's one of the ways we're able to keep the museum free admission. If you found out about this from a friend or from some other way, please become a supporter of Planet Word. If you go to planetwordmuseum.org, you can subscribe to our newsletter, see all the different membership levels. It would be wonderful to have your support. My guest tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Dan Jurafsky. He is a professor of linguistics and computer science at Stanford. And he is the author of this book, The Language of Food, A Linguist Reads the Menu, which we sell here in the gift shop at Planet Word. But Dan, thank you so much for joining us. We're just delighted to have you.
Oh, Rebecca, I'm delighted to be here. This is fabulous.
So let's dive in. You say that this book started not because of some fancy exotic ingredient, but actually the lowly, ubiquitous condiment ketchup. How did ketchup lead to this book?
America's national sauce. So I was
not
a grad
my favorite. Are you a ketchup fan?
I am a ketchup fan. Yes, I had ketchup today, in fact, and yesterday, now that you mention it. But yes, I mean, ketchup, it's an amazing, I like anything sweet and sour, and ketchup is the ultimate sweet and sour. You know, it's kind of if you think of it, it's a tomato chutney is what our modern ketchup has become. But that is not how it began. What interested me about ketchup was I was living in Hong Kong. I was a grad student, and everyone in Hong Kong knew that ketchup was a Chinese word. People were like, yeah, of course, ketchup is Chinese. And I thought, oh, that's like, you know, Americans think pizza is American, and everybody thinks they invented things. And, you know, ketchup is America's national sauce. It can't possibly be Chinese. And of course, they were right, and I was wrong, and ketchup is Chinese. And so I got so excited by this story that I started doing research, and I traveled around, and it's really a fascinating story.
So you don't associate tomatoes with Chinese cuisine at all?
No, and so the tomatoes are a recent invention. Ketchup is thousands of years old. So the original ketchup started with fishermen in Southeast Asia, in the hill tribes who are fishermen, and the freshwater creeks, the lakes of Southeast Asia. So imagine you're a fisherman, you're catching all this fish. What do you do in the dry season? Creeks dry up, so you've got to preserve the fish. So what do? Salt is the traditional preserving agent. So what they would do is layer fish and salt and fish and rice in between. And the rice and fish and salt, the rice would undergo lactic acid fermentation. You got this kind of gooey mess, but the fish would be salted and firm and preserved by this fermentation. And so you preserve the fish. And this idea of like kind of stinky fish fermentation spread over all of Southeast Asia. And then as the Chinese moved south into that region, they picked up this fermentation, this fish, these kind of fermented fish products in general, and they became very popular. They underlie, in fact, the origin of sushi, and the popular sauces that we have today, like Vietnamese fish sauce or Thai fish sauce, are the descendants of this kind of fish sauce product. But it turns out that the same fish sauce became ketchup. So I'm going to tell you the ending. And what happened was waves of Chinese sailors spread south from China to Indonesia and Malaysia and settled there. And they were not only they were making what Chinese condiments. So they were making soy sauce, and they were making this kind of fish sauce. And right at this time, say the 1600s, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, they're coming to Asia. So they're sailing to Southeast Asia. They're on the way to China. They're looking for, China's the industrial center of the world. China's where porcelain is made and textiles are made, cotton and silk, and it's all made there, spices. So they're going there for all of these products, and they get to Southeast Asia, and here are these ethnic Chinese soy sauce makers, and they're making one other thing. So imagine again that you're a sailor on this British ship. It takes you a year to go from England to Malaysia or Indonesia or Hong Kong. It's what are you going to drink on these boats? There's no sources of fresh water, so they brought beer, they brought wine, but the wine goes bad, in the heat. This is the tropics. IPAs hadn't been invented yet. There weren't hops in the beers yet. Beers go bad. So they get to Indonesia and they find that these Chinese soy sauce makers and fish sauce makers are making arak. Arak is the world's first commercially produced liquor. It's a palm sugar distillate. So they're distilling liquor. The British, so excited, the sailors are very happy. They buy thousands of barrels of arak every year for the British Navy. And while they're doing it, they buy this local fish sauce. What's the fish sauce called in the local Hokkien dialect of Chinese? It's called ketchup. And they buy this ketchup and they bring it home. And British food of the 1600s, what's the sauce? England has one sauce. This is a famous saying, right? One sauce, many religions. What's the sauce? It's butter. And so you flavor the butter. So they added soy sauce, they added fish sauce, different kinds of butter flavorings became the British sauce. And so ketchup became an expensive imported ingredient. And what do you do when you have an expensive imported food? Well, immediately you get knockoff. So there were knockoff British ketchups. And well, some of them had fish, they had anchovies, but some had other kind of umami ingredients. You got mushrooms and walnuts, savory. Jane Austen's family had a savory walnut ketchup. And then the tomatoes come from the New World, from the Portuguese or the Spanish, perhaps from the Jews, through Portugal into England. These tomatoes come, and tomatoes are also very high in umami. And so you start to get these tomato ketchup recipes, still with anchovies, still very savory. And then America, we have a taste for sugar, and American ketchups got sweeter and sweeter over the 1800s. And sort of by 1900, we get our modern, my favorite taste, the sweet and sour tomato ketchup.
And, I always thought that the word was CATSUP and that the KETCHUP was almost a transliteration for people who didn't want to fool with the odder, less obvious spell,
Yes,
that is intuitive spelling. Where do the words come from?
That is great. So for one thing, as a linguist, the fact that it has two spellings tells you that this comes from a language that wasn't written in the Latin alphabet.
Yeah.
So that's another hint, right? That it comes from somewhere else. We don't know for sure, but my theory is that ketchup with a K was the Dutch spelling, the way the Dutch thought about spelling this Hokkien word, and ketchup with a C was the way the Portuguese thought to spell this Hokkien. So both the Dutch and the Portuguese were settling in Indonesia. The Hokkien fishermen and soy sauce makers were making this ketchup, and they were trying to transcribe this word, and it got spelled in these both ways. And English borrowed it from, the Portuguese and the Dutch were there first, and the English came later. And then the spelling, changed over the last couple hundred years. So for a while, ketchup with a C was the American spelling, and ketchup with a K was the British spelling. And then that flipped just because Heinz was using the British spelling to be different than all the American ketchups, but then Heinz became the largest seller. So then all the other ketchup with a C manufacturers switched to the K. So now the K is much more common, just for this kind of accidental history of branding, really.
And the original Chinese word, does the word and does the sauce still exist?
No, I mean, yes. I mean, there certainly are fish sauces all through the south of China. The word ketchup doesn't exist anymore, as far as I can tell. I've talked to Hokkien linguists. The word zup exists. It's fact exists in lots of southern dialects. So zup is the word in Cantonese for sauce still. So the word for soy sauce,
any sauce.
Cantonese, any kind of sauce. Yeah. So the word for soy sauce in Cantonese, si zup. That's you can still that is why everyone in Hong Kong recognized the word. They're like, oh, it ends in zup. It's a Chinese sauce, obviously.
Right. It's like words that start in al, you assume are from the Arabic. But
yes, exactly. Well, there's a lot of words from Arabic, even the ones not with al. A lot of foods. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So the subtitle of the book is A Linguist Reads the Menu. So let's do that. You say, I know it can be a little terrified to be quoted back to yourself, but you say, every time you read a description of a dish on a menu, You're looking at all sorts of latent linguistic clues about how we think about wealth and social class, how our society views our food, even clues about all sorts of things that restaurant marketers might not want us to know. So what can we learn linguistically from looking at a menu?
Well, my favorite thing is to think about what they say and what they leave out. And so to study this, we did a lot of sort of large scale linguistic analysis. So my colleagues and I looked at 6,000 or 7,000 menus and looked at what kind of words restaurants used. Let's say if the restaurant was a different price point, what inexpensive restaurants use, what are restaurants trying to appeal to the middle class use, what a very fancy, one night in a year restaurants, what kind of language do they use? So for example, a middle-priced restaurant, what we found is they have a tendency to use a lot of really descriptive adjectives. So that's your zesty, your rich, your golden brown, your crispy or creamy. So I've got some examples. Crispy white meat tender served with a creamy Creole sauce. Zesty chili pepper cream sauce. That's your middle-priced restaurants.
I did not think through doing this program before dinner, by the way.
Right. Oh, yes, we're gonna have some good ones. Okay, so suppose you're a cheap restaurant, you're a diner, you're a very, very simple corner sandwich shop, inexpensive. What do your menus look like? Now, here's the kind of adjectives that are used on really inexpensive restaurants. Delicious, gourmet, flavorful, terrific. In other words, it's as if these inexpensive restaurants are like, well, we're afraid to call the food golden brown because maybe it isn't quite golden brown, but we're just going to use this generic positive word, delicious or gourmet. And so if you see the word delicious or gourmet, you know that something so 100 years ago on menus, there's some great menu collections at the New York Public Library. 100 years ago on menus, the word gourmet was used only by gourmet restaurants. And now gourmet is used only on the cheapest restaurant. So, so if you're looking for gourmet, don't look, be worried if you see the word gourmet. And then we can just measure this. So for example, every time you use one of these adjectives like delicious or gourmet, if you're running a little statistical model to predict the price of the dish goes down 2% for every time you use one of those vague adjectives.
And what's that about? What's the correlation?
Well, I mean, so, why? Well, let me give you a third example and then we'll look at the whole system. So what about expensive restaurants? So you could imagine, 100 years ago, if you look at fancy menus, they had a lot of French in them. Like that's the way you indicated being fancy. You had a lot of French and you had very long menu descriptions. There's a great menu collection also in San Francisco of local menus, and they're very long. And even the Italian restaurants, the menus have lots of French in them because that's how you signal to high class. What you do now, high class restaurants, you have these very short menus with like one word or three words, and they're really complicated words that people don't know, so that you'll have to ask the waiter what they mean. And just by doing this, we're showing that we're educated and we're high class. So it's as if there's this climb, like if you're really educated and you're a high class place, well, we're going to show that by not being we're going to be modest, and we're not going to mention any of our wonderful golden brown crispiness of our food. If we're a middle-priced restaurant, we're going to be earnest and talk about why we're middle-priced. And if we're a very cheap restaurant, well, we're just going to avoid over-promising and just call it delicious. Yeah.
Well, also you make the point that you'd never use qualifiers like fresh or real cream, things like that at a high-end restaurant because those are expected. Just by having to define that it's not, fake crab, you're already declassing your.
That's exactly right. Like if a fancy restaurant said, we serve real crab, you would worry, right?
Right.
Because we serve real crab means you came into this conversation with us, assuming we might not serve real crab. And so we're reassuring you. And that's, a fancy upscale restaurant does not want to be in the position of reassuring you that they're not serving you fake food. Yeah, and this whole idea about real crab, the realness, actually, you can even look at when the word real appears on menus as telling you something about the history of food technology. So when did the word real start to be very common on menus in front of the word butter? So real butter. Real butter appears in the 60s on menus. Real whipping cream appears in the 70s. Real bacon starts appearing on menus in the 90s. Why? In each case, 10 years before the 60s, well, the margarine tax was repealed and margarine became very, very common. So restaurants are like, oh, we have to show that we're not using margarine. And in the 70s, you have Cool Whip. And so restaurants are like, we're not using Cool Whip. We're using real whipped cream. And then bacon bits are invented. So we're not using, so you can use the word real to tell that, in fact, artificial food has been invented.
There's also that trend in high-end restaurants of spending a lot of words on the sources of things. You know,
absolutely.
Like, come meet your individual goat who provided this cheese for you.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we think of this as a kind of authenticity. So there's this idea that in expensive restaurants that we're going to be authentic by telling you where your food comes from. And of course, people want to know where their food comes from. And but expensive restaurants spend a lot of time focusing on the farm that it was grown, and you know, you might see the word green market cucumbers on an expensive menu. I mean, all cucumbers come from a market, right? So there's nothing different about, but so, you know, if it was a green market, well, what other kind of market would it have been? But the fancy restaurants are going to tell you, yeah.
San Francisco is almost a minor character in this book because you are lucky to live in one of the world's great food cities. I used to live there, but I left in about 2006. What trends are you seeing now? Because I feel like the food scene there sets them a lot.
Oh, that is a great question. I see similar trends in San Francisco, in LA, in New York, in here. Actually, one exciting trend I see, we were going to a lot of, my wife is Chinese and we go to Chinatown a lot. And one thing we saw in San Francisco, in LA, is young Chinese American chefs are reclaiming Chinatowns by creating new kinds of Chinese and American, you know, what we used to call fusion, but fusion got a bad name, but ways of integrating foods from different cultures. And there's a lot of really exciting food being created. There's a lot of exciting criticism being written these days. So I think it's a great time for immigrant food. It's also a great time for the sort of the grandchildren of the immigrants who are reclaiming their grandparents' food and modifying it. So yeah, this is a great time for food in general in America.
Interesting. So speaking of criticism, obviously most of us are not menu writers, but many of us can be food reviewers if we want to participate in this sort of crowdsource review things, which is another linguistic data set. What can you tell us about positive versus negative reviews?
Oh, absolutely. So this is very fun. So this is another project we did where we looked at hundreds of thousands of Yelp reviews of restaurants online. So I'm going to read you a negative review. So this is something that somebody really, really hated this restaurant. And I'm just going to skip some of the words because it's very long. So the bartender was absolutely horrible. We waited 10 minutes before we got her attention. And then we had to wait another 45 minutes for the entrees. We had to stalk the waitress to get the check. She didn't make eye contact. So there's the review. I've left out some pieces, but you'll notice no mention of the food at all. This is all about the waitress and the bartender, and we had to do, this happened to us and that happened to us. And so we got thinking, what's going on with these negative reviews? And so we looked at the literature when, what kind of language happens that has these exact characteristics. They're stories about people because they're talking about the waiter and the waitress. They're negative. They're written in the past tense. Everything I said was in the past tense. And they overuse the words we and us. So they're more likely to use the first person plural than I. And what kind of language is that? And it turns out that there's a social psychologist at Austin, in Texas, Jamie Pennybaker, who studied a lot people who've been traumatized. So people who've gone through, where there's been deaths or there's been large traumatic accidents. And what he shows in his theories is that people who go through trauma, they tend to use the past tense because they want to distance themselves from the trauma that's happened. And they tend to use the word we more than I because this trauma, this bad thing happened to them, but they're going to, we together got through this bad thing. So in other words, he's finding when there's a bonfire or there's an earthquake and people are writing about it afterwards, they use the same language that people use when they're writing 1-star reviews on Yelp. In other words, 1-star reviews are trauma narratives. We've been, mildly trauma. Nobody died in these restaurants, I hope, but we've been, mildly traumatized, and so we're using the language of trauma to talk about it. So it's not about the food. It tells you that the personal interaction is so much a part of what it is to be a restaurant.
And what about positive reviews? How are they different?
Oh, positive reviews. So let me see if I can show you a picture. Yeah. So here's the kind of phrases that people who use positive reviews tend to use in their reviews. So they talk about orgasmic pastry, seductively seared foie gras, or my favorite, very naughty deep fried pork belly. So in other words, they're talking about this food as if it was sex. They're using these kind of sexual metaphors for food. And that's kind of interesting, but that's not the only thing. It turns out they don't use these sexual metaphors for all foods. They use them only when the restaurant is expensive. So here's a really fun graph. I like to make fun graphs. So on the x-axis, you have restaurant price. And on the y-axis, you have how many mentions of sex there are in the reviews. And you can see that as the restaurant price goes up, people talk more and more, use sex as a metaphor. So it's as if these, fabulous restaurant meals, it's a sexual orgasmic experience. And that's the way we have of understanding this that's the way we're talking about food these days. That's expensive restaurants. So what about cheap restaurants? How do people talk about fast food and late night food? So they use phrases like, I'm addicted to the wings, or the fries are like crack, or I crave their cupcakes. So they're using the language of addiction. And once again, the cheaper the restaurant, the more they're using this kind of language of addiction. So it's as if expensive restaurants, we have this metaphor of sex. Cheap restaurants, it's as if we're sort of feeling guilty that we're eating what are these cheap foods, the junk foods that we're eating when we're going out for beer and late at night. It's wings and it's French fries and it's so we're feeling a little guilty for these things. And by talking about them as a drug, it's like, well, it's not my fault I ate those French fries. The cupcake kind of forced itself down my throat because I was addicted, and it's beyond my control. So you can see people's unmentioned guilt just in the fact that they're using this metaphor instead of that metaphor for how they talk about different foods.
Huh. And do you think that's the key, that sort of personal responsibility? One, I sought it out and anyone would seek it out because it's sexually wonderful. And one, I couldn't help myself. It was out of my control.
I like the couldn't help myself out of control. The sexual one, I feel like it's hard to say. I mean, if you look at these reviews, sometimes you get these very long reviews. So people there's a sort of narrative of, I'm going to walk you through my amazing meal. It's like an unpacking video, but it's of my amazing meal. And so it's partly, it's sharing, it's partly bragging, it's partly wondering at this amazingness, and sex has become, if you look at wine reviewing language, there was also a shift over the last 20 or 30 years, especially in the 90s, toward using sexual metaphors for wine, or body metaphors like big shouldered wines or muscular wines, or these sort of things. So the idea of the body comes in to food in general, which is not surprising. It's a sensory pleasure. So that's it's not so crazy.
You also made the point with this review analysis that I found fascinating, that the language of negativity is more differentiated. We have more words, more types of words with more differentiated meanings for describing negative opinions, and that is true in several languages. What is
Absolutely,
that about?
Yeah, this is called, there's sort of two countervailing tendencies. One is called negative differentiation, and one is called the Pollyanna principle. So the negative differentiation says, it turns out in all languages, we just have more ways of talking about negative things than positive things. So if you look at reviews, I don't know, we looked at beer reviews for this example, but people have a lot of ways of talking about what they didn't like about the beer. The color was too pale, or the taste was like rice, or all these things, or take Cantonese, my favorite language. There's a lot of ways of describing a bad smell. something can be the smell of like a nut going off is like nick or yick, and the smell of like flour that's a little rancid is hong, and the lammy smell of lamb, that's so there's all these, and what do you call the good smells? Well, you call them good, or what is your favorite word for a good smell? We don't even really have a word for smell.
We use taste words. We say delicious.
We say delicious. Like, this smells amazing. You have to use a random positive word. We don't have like, different ways to say stinky. So, in fact, Cantonese has a really common word to mean smells good, but just one. It's the word hung, which is the Hong of Hong Kong. Hong Kong means harbor that smells good. And we don't even have a word for that. But the negative words, well, we have lots of ways to say something's bad. So, and, people have said, well, maybe this is evolutionary, maybe like, if you're a caveman and, you need to have a word for a lot of different dangerous things, like, is it a tiger that's gonna, or is there a hole in the ground? You better differentiate the bad things because you're gonna have to survive. Whereas, the good things, like if you get it wrong, like, no one's gonna die. So maybe, that's what's going on.
It's interesting. Somehow we as humans think negative experiences are distinct from each other, whereas positive experiences are just,
Yes. I mean, Tolstoy said it, right? Every happy family is alike.
Right,
Every
right.
unhappy family is unhappy in their own ways. Yeah, it's Anacrenita. It's like, people. Yeah, this is an understanding that we have of how it is to be human. Yeah.
While we're talking about your studies, we have a question from the audience who says, how do you rule out confounding variables? Lower end and higher end clientele differ in their characteristics. And with the past tense, we, us, would that be explained by eating out as a communal activity?
Yeah, great question. So for all, I glossed over the methodologies for all these things, but for social science, and linguistics is a social science, like you're always asking, oh, what could have caused my result that wasn't one of my, what are my confounders? So you think a lot about the confounders. So for example, for these studies, we're running these big regressions. Regression is the standard statistical analysis in the social sciences. So in a regression, you ask, does some factor cause another factor after controlling for these 10 other things? And those 10 other things are the potential confounds. So for example, for the we, us, it could be that more people write reviews with using we than using I, because eating out is communal. But it's the bad reviews that use more we's than I. So in general, reviews do use slightly more we's than I's. But so you can control for the amount of we's and I's in a general review, but the bad reviews use even more we's than the good reviews. Presumably people eat communally equally often if they liked or disliked the restaurant, but it's the bad ones where they talk about communals. Yeah.
And without going too deep into the weeds on methodology, you did control for a ton of factors in terms of price, location,
absolutely,
publicity.
Yes.
Was it popular? There was
just the type of food. So there's for sure differences in how do people talk about Chinese food, how they talk about Mexican food, how they talk about French food are all very different. So you control for the restaurant type. We actually controlled on menus for the exact item, like was it a pizza or was it a salad? So the actual details are a lot of little computer programs measuring a lot of words. Yeah, there's a lot of confounding variables being measured. Whether the restaurant's on a main street or a side street turns out to be a factor that economists like Tyler Cowen have talked about. So yeah, you got to control for everything.
Yeah, good thing you've got that computer science in addition to the linguistics.
Yes, very handy, very handy. Fun data. It's very fun data.
I want to touch on one point that I wouldn't if it weren't in the museum, but for anyone who has been to Planet Word, one of the very first galleries you visit is this massive word wall. In fact, some of the leftover letters from the word wall are behind you there, and those white ones.
Nice.
And one of the things you learn is that of all the different language traditions that contributed to English, because we rifle other languages for spare grammar and vocabulary, there's this binary of the animal versus the food derived from the animal. So like pig versus pork. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yes, so that's a good one. So that's like, yeah, we have pig and pork and cow and beef and sheep and lamb and mutton and yeah. So one of the main theories for this, why does English have these two kinds of words, and lots of languages do? Not every language does, but many languages do. Actually, Sir Walter Scott in Ivanhoe gives a theory which is quite reasonable for the English case. So why in English it turns out that the word for the food, so beef or pork, is the French word, the word that the Normans brought from France into English. The word for the animal, cow or pig, is the Saxon word, the Germanic word from the Anglo-Saxons who were there before the Normans came. So Walter Scott's theory is, well, the lords who are speaking French, they eat the food, but it's the peasants who are Anglo-Saxon who are raising the animals. So the words come from different languages. Now, it's a cute theory. It may very well be, it seems very reasonable to me, but doesn't work for all languages, right? So Spanish has pez and pescado, fish viewed as a food, or fish, swimming in the water. So lots of languages have these distinctions without having, separate groups of people. Yeah, it's a neat question. Like, why do we, is it come from animism and from imagining, our food as having a soul and being a living creature is kind of qualitatively different than being a food, and we like to distinguish them? Is that a natural human tendency? I don't know. It's a great question.
And it's interesting that in English it's ended up with two different etymologies.
Yes. Yeah. In English, it's this historical fact that English, to a large part, has these two languages as its origin. It makes it, maybe it's more obvious to us.
Yeah. I want to talk about the difference between conventionalism versus naturalism. And first of all, let me kind of define those terms. So the idea is that a name can be anything, right? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It's just a word. It could be different in a different language. It doesn't convey the essence of the thing in some way. That's conventionalism. Or maybe that's not always true. Maybe there is some commonality of words that actually do associate themselves with the thing in some essential way. How does that play out when we're talking about food?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, my favorite version of the naturalist. So conventionalism, right, names the link between how we say a word and the meaning. It's just random. And naturalism, my favorite version of that is from Plato. Plato says the naturalist hypothesis is there's an inherently correct name for everything for both Greeks and barbarians, meaning all the rest of us that aren't. So all those other languages, says Plato. This is in the Cratylus. So modern scientists, linguists, are mostly our guiding assumption is conventionalism most of the time. Obviously, if there was a perfect name, Platonic, as it were, name for a way of saying the name of an object, then every language would have the same name. And of course, languages are different. So conventionalism is just wrong in the simple case. But it turns out there's some cracks where naturalism creeps in, and Plato talks about this a little bit in the Cratylus. So and the cracks have to do with sound symbolism. So sound symbolism is the idea that even though in general meanings are arbitrary and different, the way you say a word has nothing to do with its meaning, some sounds have some symbols, some symbolic meaning, and the most common one that we talk about has to do with what's the two kinds of vowels, and they're called front vowels and back vowels. So, and by front I mean that your tongue is in the front of your mouth, like toward the front, and that's vowels like e, I, and eh. And if you touch your tongue, if your hands are clean, when you're saying those vowels, you will see your tongue is right there in the front. So the area right in front of the tongue is very small, and to make an e, I, eh. And by contrast, your back vowels, that's your o, ah, your tongue is way sort of in the back of the mouth, and the front of the mouth is all open. There's lots of space in there. And it turns out that across lots of languages, we tend to use front vowels for little things. So in English, little, itsy bitsy, teeny weeny, all those is and e's kind of instinctively feel small to us. French, petit, Spanish, chico, these e's. And the back vowels, that's like huge, humongous, enormous, large. So all those big back vowels. So there's something about that going on. And it turns out studies have shown across lots of languages. And this got me interested. And when I was just in the cracker aisle one day of our local little supermarket down the street, and noticed that all the cracker names seem to have I in them. So Ritz and Triscuit and Wheat Thins and Chicken and a Biscuit, lots of is. Well, those are front vowels. And other researchers had suggested that ice creams, which, you kind of want crackers to be thin and crispy and light, and you want ice creams to be like solid and heavy. And so other researchers had noticed that ice creams might have back vowels. And so, what are ice cream flavors? Well, it's like chocolate and rocky road and caramel, all those ahs and aws and ohs. And so sure enough, we did this little study, and sure enough, crackers do in fact tend to have these little short vowels and these little front vowels, and ice cream names tend to have these back vowels. So it's as if, marketers are either on purpose, because marketers hire linguists who know this stuff, lots of naming, branding agencies, that's where our students get jobs. Think about that. When you're making a cracker name, you don't want it to sound heavy. You want it to sound light. And so you're going to use this kind of vowel. So this is sound symbolism, this idea that there's some, naturalistic association. Now, why do we have this? Why is it that these front vowels sound small and these back vowels sound big? There's some really great theories about this, but the simple idea is a front vowel like it has a really small space in front of the tongue, and it has a particular high frequency component to it. It's called the second formant, but it's anyway, it's the pitch of the vowel of the sound, the vowel is higher, and back vowels, which have a kind of a bigger resonance cavity. Bigger resonance means larger wavelength, smaller frequency. So back vowels have a lower second formant. So front vowels are sort of high pitched in this way. Back vowels are low pitched, and this dates back to how we think about animals in general. So Eugene Morton and John O'Holly's phoneticians and ethnobiologists have shown that animals in general, so big animals make big sounds, right? Lions make roars, and little animals make little high-pitched sounds because they have small vibrating instruments, and so they vibrate faster. And the big, lion vocal cords are slow, they're big and they move slower. So big animals, low sound, small animals, high-pitched sound. And it's as if we picked up on this kind of instinctively, and so we instinctively think of high-pitched sounds as coming from small things, and big pitch sounds coming from. So this is like an old evolutionary thing that we're sort of, that maybe advertisers are picking up on, this subtle human deep down, a thing in order to name our cracker brands, which is kind of exciting.
It's actually, again, something you can explore at Planet Word, where we go into the classic linguist example of Kiki and Booba.
Oh,
where
fabulous.
People are shown a spiky shape and a rounded shape and asked, which would you call a Kiki and which you would call a Booba? And you're the linguist, the data. It's some astounding correlation that the sharp, regardless of where you are in the world, how old you are, what your first language is, the spiky shape is a Kiki and the rounded shape is a Booba.
Yes, if you this is run across many dozens of languages. If people see the shape on the left, they call it Kiki or they call it taquete. You give them the two options, and if you give them Maluma or taquete, they call the one on the right Maluma or Booba. They use these back vowels to describe the rounded shape, and they use these front vowels to describe the sharp shape, and they use consonants like K and T to describe the sharp shapes, and they use K and T are stop consonants. You make a K by sticking your tongue against the roof of your mouth for a very brief second, letting air build up behind your tongue, and then pulling it back sharply. So there's a silence and then an explosion of sound. So it's a very sharp change in the sound. Whereas sounds like M or L or M are maluma. You can continue them for a very long time. They're smooth and continuing. I think I have a picture here. Yeah, this is me saying, this is a sound wave of me. Those of you looking at the screen, this is a sound wave on the left of me saying maluma and saying takete, and you can see the sharp, jagged t, k, t, and so there's something about synesthesia that somehow our visual perception of sharpness and our hearing about what sounds sharp and linguistically. So Charles Spence at Oxford, who works on perception related to food, kind of the premier lab that works on that, showed that people tend to use takete, the sharp word, when they taste dark chocolate, but maluma, the kind of smooth word for milk chocolate, and takete for carbonated beverages, and maluma for still beverages. So this idea is deeply human and very closely related to food. Yeah. And
I'm certain not at all lost on product namers.
Yeah, right. I mean, yes, advertise, yes, hire more linguists. Find that to be great. Students need jobs. Yeah.
So we have a bunch of questions I want to get to. Someone says, I love the theory of the Norman conquest, but why are the words for chicken the animal and chicken the meat the same? True with fish as well.
Yes, that's right. So that's a good complaint about really any theory any causal theory that tries to say, I'm going to explain you why language changed in this way, which is we can never, there's a lot of randomness in how language changes. So, you could say, well, maybe, maybe even the poor people could raise their own chickens, or fishing. You didn't have peasants, raising the fish for the lords, like maybe, I don't know, Normans went out fishing because that's a thing that lords did. They fished. You could make up a story, but we just don't know. But I think what's true is that even in the languages where we distinguish these things, it's only a few foods. So it's presumably like foods that are significant or that played some social role at the time this distinction happened. Yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, I try to work in lots of projects in my lab, and my students work on language change. And whenever you try to study a law that that is very universal in predicting some change, it's extremely there's lots of exceptions. Yeah.
Yeah, I keep going back to, we did a program about cryptography and patterns in cryptography, and our guest said codes are complicated on purpose and language is complicated by accident.
Yeah, that's right. That's really good. Yeah, it's the crufty stuff there's a lot of that lying around, that, well, some high prestige teenager, language change mostly happens with teenager women making changes, and then when they have kids, their kids pick up on those changes, and so women are the drivers usually of language change, and so some teenager makes some change, and because that her social group liked that change, and so you can't predict that, right? This is what happens to happen in a particular social group at a particular time.
Someone asks, has the etymology of food helped inform other fields? For example, I've heard people wanting to try to identify where rice was first cultivated by looking at words for rice.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's lots, I haven't done this myself, but yeah, there's lots of really exciting work looking at the history of like the sweet potato and the banana, and I'm missing an important one, rice, yeah, by looking at the language. So I'm particularly interested, for example, in a common vegetable in southern China and Southeast Asia and the Pacific that's called ong choy in Chinese. It's it's called, we usually call it water spinach in English. It's like a spinach, like with a hollow stem, but yeah, I've been looking at it. It's called rau mong in Vietnamese, and it's called kangkong in Indonesian, and it's called pak bong in Thai. So the words are all clearly something's going on. There's a lot of ongs going on. It's ngong and ong and bong and pong. So, and looking at the regions, and yeah, so narrowing in, it seems like we're going to find some interesting fact there. But yes, people have used this for sure to look at the origin of, I think sweet potatoes is the classic example, but rice too. You can see, or sugar, or you can certainly look at find like, where do we get the word sugar? Well, if you trace it back through, we get it from the Persians, who got it from the Arabs, who got it from from Sanskrit, and then it kind of gets lost because sugar was probably domesticated in New Guinea. So somehow it made its way to India, and then up to us. So sometimes we can't trace it back all the way, but other times we can sort of triangulate. That was that was a long-winded answer, but yes.
No, it's an interesting field. And you started there with ketchup, that you can kind of trace trade routes and population exchange.
Well, I mean, yeah, another thing about the ketchup story, like we were told in school that like the history of China is, with respect to the world, the relationship of China to the world, is that the Ming dynasty, when it comes to power, 1600, the Ming emperors sank the navy, made it illegal to sail, sank the navy, turned inward, and China, becomes inward looking and is only drawn into the world economy later by European colonial powers. But the story of ketchup, the fact is, all those European powers were going to China because that's where the industrial might of the world was. The Industrial Revolution hadn't happened yet in Europe. And so where were you what were the industrial products of those days? Textiles and ceramics. And they were made only in Asia. So Asia was in fact the economic capital of the world till much later, until Europe colonized the New World, and slavery and the gold and silver mines of the North and South Americas sort of gave the European powers the money to bootstrap the Industrial Revolution.
Just to dig in here linguistically, are there any data comparing the use of front-back vowels and voice-unvoice use of consonants in languages other than English, especially describing food?
Not that I know of. So this little cracker ice cream study I did is a very small one. There's another front-back, let's see, Annette D'Onofrio, who's a linguist at Northwestern. She did a really nice front-back vowel study with, I think it was, not food, but cooking instruments, like small and large cooking utensils, and she found similar things. But that's English. So I don't know of more studies on food in other languages. That we need that. That would be great. We need more. Food is, for a lot of reasons, food is understudied. It's finally being studied more now, but for a long time, food was like not a prestigious thing to study. And, I didn't even think of studying it till after I got tenure, and it was safe for me to study food and not, work on these crazy topics. I think because it was a women's topic, and it's just not seen as important, a daily culture is not seen as important. So I think that's finally changing, but it's still the case that there's just not enough people working on understanding the science of daily life, and food is one of those things.
We've got someone positing another theory about the animal versus meat pairs.
Excellent.
She says, for chicken, the animal versus chicken, the meat, the animal is a count noun while the meat is non-count. That makes more sense to me than when we do other animal versus meat pairs. The animals, cow, pig, sheep, are often an Anglo-Saxon word, but the meat is from the French.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So yeah, that's a really nice, because that's clearly a linguist there, pointing out that when we talk about the meat, we use a mass noun. So mass nouns are like snow, where you don't count them. So this, and you can use a singular, like snow is on the ground, but you don't say the snows. Snow is a mass noun, where like
Ernest Hemingway accepted. Yeah.
Yeah. And so chicken, the meat is a mass noun. Chicken, the animal, is a count noun. I mean, you can say, oh, the car ran over the mouse and there's mouse all over the driveway. So you can turn an animal into a mass noun in it. Sorry, that was very graphic. But yes, I mean, language
helped with the hunger you had been stoking earlier.
Yes. Okay. Good. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yes. But yeah. So right. We do think about the disembodied, as it were, the animal, the meat product, as a mass noun. Yeah. Maybe it's a way of separating it from the animal, or it's just because that's how we interact with it. It's undifferentiated mass, kind of, when we think of a chunk of food. Yeah.
Someone asks, I'm a longitudinal researcher, so this question may appeal only to me. Was there anything about you as a kid that would possibly have predicted this direction in your life as a researcher?
Oh, totally. Oh my gosh. Yes, I was always into language and into food as a kid. Yes. I got into trouble in 7th grade, and my mom had to go to the principal's office, and she didn't know why. And when she got there, the principal said, your son wants to take 2 languages and we don't allow that. And that's, yeah. So yeah, I've always really been excited by languages and cooking. Yeah. Yes. Never been very good at the cooking part, but I'm very earnest and energetic at it. Yeah.
And this feels like a good wrap-up question. Language of Food came out in 2015. Old enough that I've read it and gifted it a few times. What do you think you might find is new or different if you ran your analyses today? Or what have you noticed informally that you're interested in exploring empirically?
Well, so that's a great question. So the thing that I would do if I was starting now is video, right? I'd look at TikTok. I would, menus and reviews are great, but anybody under 20, it's all TikTok. And so there must be really exciting things to look at there. So I would look at the visual angle and vision and language and images and language. I think that would be really exciting. And maybe
right. I want to close with this quote and sort of your thoughts on it from the book. You say, the linguistic and culinary habits of our own tribe or nation are not the habits of all tribes and nations. Yet all languages and cultures share a deep commonality, the social and cognitive traits that make us human. These facets, respect for our differences and faith in our shared humanity, are the ingredients in the recipe for compassion. That's the final lesson of the language of food. But some big thoughts to close with.
I think that, yeah. I mean, my favorite food writer, Jonathan Gold, he said, beautiful things are often found in the fault lines between cultures. So, all these stories of food, it's all about, we take a food from someone else and we modify it and you respect their thing, but you build your thing and you give them your thing back. And I think that's just a happy way to interact with the rest of the world.
Well, Dan Jurafsky, it has been a pleasure to spend the last hour with you. Thank you for coming here to Planet
thanks so
Word.
much. This has been great fun.
And I highly recommend the book if you all haven't read it. The language of it's so hard with a virtual background to hold up a book, but there it is, Language of Food.
Fabulous.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks you all. Thanks everybody.